Just sign the house over, Dad. My son said it the way a man orders coffee. Flat. Bored. Like the answer was already decided, and I was simply the last piece of paperwork standing between him and what he had convinced himself he was owed. The deed was on my kitchen table, on the same scarred oak surface where his mother had rolled out pie crust for 31 years. There was a pen beside it, a blue ballpoint from a hotel in Cleveland. He had brought his own pen to my house to take my house. "You're 71, he said, tapping the paper twice with 2 fingers. "You can't manage this place anymore. We talked about this." We had not talked about this. Behind him, my daughter-in-law stood with her arms crossed, watching me the way a buyer watches a car she has already decided to lowball. I looked at the deed. I looked at the pen, and I let my hand shake, just slightly, exactly the way I had practiced. What neither of them knew was that 11 days earlier I had called my lawyer, and that the phone on the counter, the one they had walked right past, had been recording since the moment they knocked. Before I take you back to the beginning, do me one small favor. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and it means more than you know. And if stories about quiet strength are your kind of story, hit that like button and subscribe. To understand how a man ends up sitting at his own kitchen table, being asked to hand over the last thing he owns, you have to go back to the first Sunday in March, and a phone call I almost didn't answer. My name is Walter Ashford. I am 71 years old, and for 38 of those years, I was a structural engineer. That word means less to most people than it should. When people hear engineer, they picture a man with a calculator. What I actually did, for almost 4 decades, was look at things that appeared perfectly solid and find the exact place where they were about to fail. Bridges, parking structures, 10-story office buildings in Columbus with hairline cracks nobody else could see. I built a career out of a single, unglamorous skill. I could look at a beautiful surface and tell you precisely what was rotting underneath it. I was good at it. Very good. My last 11 years, I worked forensic structural analysis, which is a polite way of saying I was the man they called after something collapsed. I would stand in the rubble with a clipboard and a camera, and I would work backward. Every failure leaves a record. Every failure has a first crack, and that first crack always happened long before anybody noticed. My entire profession was built on one idea. The collapse is never the beginning. The collapse is just the moment the truth becomes visible. I would spend my 71st year learning that this is also true of families. My wife's name was Margaret. She taught 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary for 29 years. And if you had walked into that school on any random Tuesday, you would have found her kneeling next to some kid's desk, patiently explaining long division for the 5th time without a single note of frustration in her voice. That was Margaret entirely. She had an absolutely bottomless patience for people who were struggling, and absolutely no patience at all for people who were pretending. She used to say she could always tell the difference. A struggling kid gets quiet, she told me once. A lying kid gets loud. I should have written that down. I should have had it carved into the door frame. Margaret died on a Thursday in October, 3 years before any of this began. Pancreatic cancer. It took her in 11 weeks from the day of the diagnosis, which is not enough time to prepare for anything, and certainly not enough time to prepare for silence. I sat with her in that hospital room, and I held her hand, and I told her about the Wexler Bridge inspection, because it was the only thing I could think of to say that wasn't goodbye. She squeezed my hand, and she said, very quietly, "Walter, don't let them talk you out of yourself." Those were the last completely coherent words my wife spoke to me. Don't let them talk you out of yourself. At the time, I thought she was talking about grief, about the way widowers hollow out and drift, and stop being men, and start being fixtures. I thought she was warning me about loneliness. She wasn't. She was warning me about my son. I have one child. His name is Marcus, and he is 43 years old. I want to tell you something honestly, and I want you to believe me when I say it, because everything that follows depends on you understanding this. I loved that boy completely. Not in the vague, obligatory way people say they love their children. I mean, I loved him the way you love the thing you built with your own hands, and know every weakness of, and love anyway. I taught him to ride a bicycle on Cedar Lane, running alongside him with my hand on the seat until my lungs burned. I sat in a plastic chair in a freezing gymnasium for 11 years, watching him play a sport he was, if I am being truthful, never especially good at. I paid for 4 years at Ohio State, and then, when he decided halfway through that business was more his speed than biology, I paid for the 5th year too, and never once brought it up again. When he got married, I gave a toast. I said that a man is not measured by the house he builds, but by the people who feel safe inside it. Everyone clapped. Margaret cried. Marcus hugged me and said, "Love you, Dad," into my shoulder, and I believed him, because why on earth wouldn't I? His wife is named Priscilla. I am going to try to be fair to Priscilla, because I have had a long time to think about her, and because unfairness is a luxury I can no longer afford. Priscilla is 39. She sells high-end real estate in the Dublin and Powell area, and she is genuinely excellent at it, and she has never once in 14 years walked into a room without first calculating what that room is worth. She is not stupid. That was my first serious mistake. I spent years thinking of her as shallow, and shallow people are not dangerous. Priscilla was never shallow. Priscilla was patient. There is a difference, and the difference nearly cost me everything. They have 2 children, my grandchildren, Ella and Sam. Ella is 12 and reads constantly, and has her grandmother's exact laugh, which is a thing that can knock the wind out of you in a grocery store aisle if you aren't ready for it. Sam is 8, and once spent 45 minutes explaining sharks to me with total, unwavering seriousness. I mention them because I want you to understand what I stood to lose. This was never a story about money. If it had only been about money, I would have signed the deed and gone to live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Hilliard and eaten my dinners in front of the television and told myself it was fine. But it was never only about money. It never is. The house sits on 4.5 acres off Township Road 118, about 20 minutes outside the city. Margaret and I bought the land in 1981 for $31,000, which people found insane at the time, because there was nothing out there but a soybean field and a tree line. I designed the house myself. Every load path, every beam, every joint. I was 30 years old and arrogant, and I wanted to build something that would still be standing when nobody remembered my name. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch on the south face, and a foundation I over-engineered so badly that a contractor once laughed at me on site and asked if I was expecting an earthquake in central Ohio. I told him I wasn't building it for the earthquake. I was building it for the century. Margaret picked the paint colors and lost the argument about the kitchen island, which she never let me forget. We brought Marcus home to that house when he was 4 days old. Margaret's roses run along the entire east side, and every spring for 31 years she cut them back with the same pair of green-handled shears, and every spring for the last 3 years I have cut them back with the same shears, and every single spring I have done it badly. As of March of last year, a commercial appraiser would have told you the property was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $890,000. Priscilla, I would eventually learn, had a much more specific figure than that. The first crack was so small I nearly missed it. It was the first Sunday in March, and Marcus called me at 4 in the afternoon. That was already unusual. My son and I had a rhythm, and the rhythm was that I called him. It had been that way since Margaret died, and I had made a quiet peace with it, the way you make peace with a knee that doesn't bend right anymore. Dad, he said, and his voice had a strange, over-warm quality to it, like a salesman who has just remembered your first name. Hey, how you doing out there? All alone in that big place. I'm fine, I said. I'm making chili. Chili, he repeated, as though I had said something faintly tragic. That's okay. That's good. Listen, Priscilla and I were talking. We're worried about you. I remember standing in my own kitchen with a wooden spoon in my hand and feeling something cold move through my chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition. I had heard this tone before, in conference rooms, right before somebody told me the budget for the inspection had been cut. Worried about what? The house, Dad. It's a lot. All those stairs. The acreage. The roof's what? 20 years old? 11, I said. I replaced it 11 years ago. There was the smallest pause, a quarter-second of silence, and in that silence, I heard something that would take me another 6 weeks to name. He was annoyed that I had a correct answer. Right, well, anyway, we just think it's a lot for one guy. A rustle, and then Priscilla's voice, not on speaker, but close enough to the phone that I knew she had been standing beside him the entire time, listening, prompting. We just love you, Walter, she called out. We want you safe. We want you safe. 4 words. Absolutely harmless. Here is the thing about forensic structural work. A building never announces its collapse. It gives you a hairline. It gives you a door that sticks in a frame that used to close clean. It gives you a crack in the drywall that a homeowner will paint over 4 times before somebody finally calls a man like me. And every single time, when I opened up that wall, the failure had been progressing for years. The tell is never the crack. The tell is the direction of the crack. We want you safe was a crack running in the wrong direction, and I painted over it, because he was my son, and because it was Sunday, and because my chili was burning. I told him I was fine, and I hung up, and I ate dinner alone, and I did not think about it again for 11 days. That was my second mistake, and it was the expensive one. The second sign came at Ella's birthday party, on the 3rd Saturday in March. They held it at their house in New Albany, a 5-bedroom colonial that Priscilla had staged so aggressively it looked like nobody had ever been unhappy in it. I arrived at 1, carrying a wrapped copy of a book Ella had mentioned 3 weeks earlier, which I had written down on the back of a receipt, because I have never in my life trusted my memory over a piece of paper. Priscilla met me at the door. She hugged me. She has a very specific hug. One arm, brief, patting, the way you would handle a dog that might be wet. Walter, you made it. Did you drive yourself? I did, all that way. She said it with a small, pained smile, as if I had walked. Well, you're here. Inside, there were maybe 20 people. Priscilla's mother, a woman named Vanessa, who had spent 40 years perfecting the art of the sympathetic insult. Priscilla's sister. Various neighbors whose names I had been told 4 separate times, and a man I didn't know, in a gray sport coat, standing by the kitchen island with a glass of wine, who watched me walk in the way a man watches a car he's about to appraise. Marcus introduced him without introducing him. Dad, this is Grant, friend of ours. Grant shook my hand, firm grip, held about a second too long. Mr. Ashford, I've heard so much about you. A beat. The house especially. The house, I said. Township 118, right? 4.5 acres. He smiled. Beautiful parcel. Parcel. Not property. Not land. Parcel. I have sat across the table from a great many men in my career, and I learned early that people's vocabulary betrays them long before their intentions do. Nobody who loves a piece of land calls it a parcel. That is a word for people who intend to divide it. It's my home, I said pleasantly. Of course, Grant said. Of course it is. the party went on. Ella loved the book. Sam explained a different kind of shark to me. I sat in a chair in the sunroom for a while, with a plate of cake in my lap, and let the noise wash over me, and thought about Margaret, who would have been organizing the whole thing, and would have known every neighbor's name, and would have already figured out exactly who Grant was, within about 4 minutes of meeting him. Around 3 o'clock, I went to find the bathroom in the back hall, and I heard Priscilla's voice through the laundry room door. Not going to be a problem. He's slipping. You've seen him. And then Vanessa, her mother, low and dry. He seems perfectly sharp to me. He's 71, Priscilla said, with a small laugh. Trust me. Give it a year. I stood in that hallway with my hand on the wall. I want to describe to you exactly what happened in my body in that moment, because it matters, and because I have thought about it every day since. I did not feel rage. That came later, and when it came, it was cold and useful, and it stayed with me for 6 months, like a second heartbeat. What I felt in that hallway was something much stranger. I felt the floor. That's the only way I can explain it. 38 years of standing in buildings and feeling for the thing that's wrong, and my whole body just went quiet. My hearing sharpened. The noise of the party dropped away. And a very old, very familiar part of my brain, the part that had walked into a collapsed parking garage in Toledo in 1997 and known within 90 seconds exactly which column had let go. That part of me woke all the way up and said, there it is. That's the load path. Follow it. Give it a year. That is not a sentence about worry. That is a sentence about a schedule. I walked back to the party. I ate the rest of my cake. I complimented Priscilla on the decorations, and I told Marcus the yard looked good. And when Grant asked me casually whether I had ever thought about what happens to the place down the road, I let my eyes go a little vague and I said, oh, I don't know. It's hard to think about. And I watched Grant and Priscilla exchange a look across the kitchen island. It was a half second. Less. But I saw it. And I understood it. And I filed it away exactly the way I would have photographed a hairline fracture in a load-bearing column. He's slipping. Give it a year. They wanted me confused. So on the drive home, on Route 62, with the sun going down over a soybean field that had been a soybean field when I was 30 years old, and standing on my own land with a set of blueprints in my hand, I made a decision that changed absolutely everything. If they wanted a confused old man, I would give them the finest confused old man they had ever seen in their lives. And while they were busy watching him, I would do what I have done my entire career. I would find the crack, I would follow it down, and I would document every single inch of the way. I need to tell you what I did next, because people always assume the plan came all at once. It didn't. Nothing real ever does. The first thing I did, on the Monday morning after that party, was drive into the city and sit in the parking lot of a strip mall on Sawmill Road for 11 minutes, working up the nerve to walk into a law office. The office belonged to a man named Frank Delgado. I had known Frank for 19 years, in the loose way that men know each other through their wives. Margaret had taught his daughter in 4th grade. Frank had come to Margaret's funeral in a black suit that didn't fit him anymore, and he had stood at the back, and he had cried, openly, without wiping his face, and afterward, he had gripped my hand and said, Walter, anything, I mean it. I had never once taken him up on it. 3 years, and I had never called. Frank's office was small, 2 rooms above a dental practice, a window unit that rattled. He was 66, built like a retired wrestler gone comfortable, and he had a habit of taking his glasses off and cleaning them whenever he was about to say something he didn't want to say. He didn't offer me coffee. He just looked at me for a long moment and said, "You look like a man who found something in a wall." I heard my daughter-in-law say I was slipping, I told him. I heard her say, "Give it a year." There was a man at the party asking about my acreage and calling it a parcel. Frank took his glasses off. He cleaned them for what felt like a full minute. "Walter," he said finally, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think before you answer, because your answer is going to determine what kind of conversation we have. Are you telling me this because you want me to reassure you? No, because most men in your chair want reassurance. They want me to tell them they're imagining it. I can do that. It's cheaper." "Frank," I leaned forward. "I designed a building in 1994 with a mezzanine that everybody said was fine. I said it wasn't. They told me I was being difficult. 11 months later, the mezzanine came down at 4 in the morning, and if it had happened at 4 in the afternoon, it would have killed 30 people. I paused. I have never in my life been wrong about a load path, and I am not wrong now." Frank put his glasses back on. "Okay," he said. "Then let's talk about Ohio." What Frank explained to me over the next 2 hours reorganized my entire understanding of my own situation, and I am going to try to give it to you plainly, because I think a great many people watching this have no idea how exposed they actually are. He said the most dangerous thing in the world is not a bad son. The most dangerous thing in the world is a signature. Everything you're afraid of, he said, requires one thing from you. Not much. Just one moment, where you're tired, or confused, or emotional, or in a hospital gown, and somebody hands you a pen and says, "Sign here, Dad. It's just for the insurance." He tapped the desk. That's it. That's the whole crime. And once it's done, once your name's on a quitclaim deed, my friend, we are no longer having a conversation about protecting your house. We are having a conversation about suing your own child to get it back, which costs $60,000, takes 2 years, and you lose more often than you'd think. Then don't let me sign anything. That's step 1. He held up a finger. But Walter, listen to me carefully, because here's the part that most people never hear. There's a second door, and it's worse. And it's the one people like your daughter-in-law actually use. He wrote 2 words on a legal pad and turned it around. Guardianship, conservatorship. If they can't get your signature, Frank said, they don't need it. They go to a probate court, and they file a petition saying Walter Ashford is no longer competent to manage his own affairs. They bring evidence, missed appointments, confusion, a neighbor who says he found you wandering, a doctor who says you scored poorly on a cognitive screen, and if a judge agrees, that judge appoints somebody, usually a family member, usually the one who filed, to control your money, your medical decisions, and your property. He let that sit. And then they don't have to ask you to sign the house over, he said quietly. They can sign it for you. I sat very still. How often does that happen? I asked. More than you would ever believe, Frank said. It is, in my professional opinion, the single most underreported financial crime in this country. And the reason nobody talks about it is that the victims can't. By the time it's done, they've been legally declared unable to speak for themselves. The window unit rattled. Somewhere below us, a dental drill whined. Walter, Frank said, if your daughter-in-law is telling people you're slipping, she is not gossiping. She is building a record. I understood that instantly. Completely. Because it is exactly what I would have done. If you want to bring down a building, you don't hit it with a wrecking ball. That's expensive, and loud, and everyone sees you do it. You go down to the basement, and you compromise one column, and then you let time and load do the work. When it comes down 11 months later, everybody says the building was old. Priscilla wasn't going to attack me. She was going to establish that I was already falling. All right, I said. Then tell me how to build a record of my own. Frank Delgado smiled for the first time since I'd walked in, and it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has been waiting 19 years to be useful. Now, he said, we're having the right conversation. Here is what we did. Frank gave me 4 instructions that day, and I want to lay them out clearly, because they are the entire foundation of everything that came after. In my line of work, we call this the baseline survey. Before you can prove a building has moved, you must first prove, beyond dispute, where it was standing on day 1. The first instruction was medical. Get a full neuropsychological evaluation, Frank said. Not a 15-minute screening at your GP. A full battery. 4 hours. Board-certified neuropsychologist. Memory, executive function, processing speed. The works. And Walter, do it now. Do it before anything happens. Because the day after they file a petition, any test you take looks like a defense. The test you take today is a fact. I did it 8 days later, at a clinic in Upper Arlington, with a doctor named Amara Osei, who had a very quiet voice and absolutely no interest in flattering me. It took 4 hours and 20 minutes. She had me repeat lists of words. She had me draw a clock. She had me sort cards by rules that changed without warning, which I later learned was the entire point. She had me solve problems under time pressure while she watched. 2 weeks later, the report came back, 22 pages. I will give you the sentence that mattered, and I will give it to you exactly. Mr. Ashford's performance is within the superior range across all cognitive domains assessed, with executive function and abstract reasoning at the 94th percentile relative to age-matched peers. There is no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment. I read that sentence 11 times in my car in the parking lot. Then I drove to Frank's office and put it on his desk, and Frank read it, and he laughed out loud, a short, delighted bark of a laugh, and he said, "Walter, do you understand what you just did? You just poured the footing." The second instruction was documentary. Every conversation with your son and his wife, from this moment forward, gets written down, Frank said. Date, time, duration, location, who was present, what was said, as close to verbatim as you can manage, handwritten, in a bound notebook, not a legal pad, not loose pages, a bound book where pages can't be added or removed. And you write it the same day, not the next week. Contemporaneous notes are evidence. Reconstructed notes are opinion. I bought a black hardcover notebook at an office supply store on Bethel Road for $11.99. It had 200 pages. By the end of it, I would fill 141 of them. The third instruction was financial. Freeze your exposure, Frank said. Not dramatically, quietly. Is anyone a joint owner on any account? Is anyone a beneficiary who doesn't need to be? Does anyone have a key, a password, a power of attorney, access to a safe deposit box? This is where my stomach dropped, and I want to be honest with you about it, because I think shame is the thing that keeps most people from ever fighting back. Marcus had been a signatory on my checking account since Margaret died. I had put him on it myself. 3 years earlier, in a hospital waiting room, at 2 in the morning, with my wife dying 11 floors above me, my son had said, "Dad, let me handle the bills for a while," and I had signed a form a bank employee brought to the hospital, because I could not remember what day it was, and because he was my son, and because it was the kindest thing anyone had offered me in a month. I had never taken him off. "How much is in it?" Frank asked. "About 41,000, I said. "It's my operating account. Property taxes, insurance, everything runs through it." Frank was very quiet. "Walter," he said, "I want you to go home and pull the last 24 months of statements. Every page. And I want you to actually read them. Not skim. Read." "Frank, I've read them." "No," he said. "You've balanced them. That's a different activity entirely." The fourth instruction was the one I resisted. "You're going to have to perform," Frank said. I said no. I said absolutely not. I said I was not going to pretend to be an idiot in my own home, to trap my own child. That it was undignified, that it was beneath me, that I would simply confront them and be done with it. Frank let me finish. He is very good at letting a man finish. Then he said, "How's that going to go, Walter? Walk me through it." You call Marcus. You say, "I heard your wife say I'm slipping." He says, "Dad, that's not what she meant. You misheard." And you know what happens next? He leaned forward. "You just told them you're onto them. They stopped talking in front of you. They moved the timeline up. And now the only thing you've accomplished is that you've handed them your best piece of evidence. You've told them you're paranoid, you're accusing family of conspiracies, you're not yourself lately. Congratulations. You just made their case for them." He took off his glasses. "They've already decided what you are," he said, more gently. "You cannot talk them out of it. So the only question left is whether you're going to be what they think you are, or whether you're going to let them believe it long enough to say something they can't take back." I sat in that chair for a long time, and then I thought about Margaret, on the last coherent day of her life, squeezing my hand. Don't let them talk you out of yourself. And I understood, finally, that she hadn't been warning me about drifting. She had been telling me something much sharper. She had been telling me that the world was going to try to convince me I was less than I was, and that the moment I believed it, I was finished. You cannot let them talk you out of yourself. But nobody said anything about letting them think they had. "All right," I said. "Teach me how to be a confused old man." Frank Delgado grinned. "Walter," he said, "you're a structural engineer. You've spent 38 years watching things fail. Just do a very slow, very convincing impression of one." I went home that night, and I pulled 24 months of bank statements out of the filing cabinet in my office. It took me until 3 in the morning. I laid them out on the dining room table, Margaret's table, the one we bought at an estate sale in 1986, and I went through them the way I would go through a load calculation, line by line, left to right, no skipping. And on the 11th statement, I found it. 16 months earlier, on a Tuesday in November, there was a withdrawal for $4,000. I had not made it. I sat back in my chair. I remembered November. November was the month I had the hip surgery. I was in a rehabilitation facility in Westerville for 11 days, on painkillers, and Marcus had handled everything, and I had been so overwhelmingly grateful that I had cried about it, alone, in a hospital bed, because that is what happens to men when their bodies fail them and their children step up. $4,000. I kept going. The next month, $3,500. The month after that, $4,000. Then $2,000. Then $5,000. Then $4,000 again. 11 withdrawals, across 16 months. Every single one of them under the threshold that would have triggered a reporting requirement. Every single one of them from an account he was legally a signatory on, which meant not one of them was, technically, theft. I added it up 3 times, because I did not believe it the first 2 times. $47,500. My son had taken $47,500 out of my account over 16 months, and I had never noticed, because I had never looked, because I had spent 3 years balancing my statements instead of reading them, exactly the way Frank said. I want to tell you what that felt like, and I find that I can't, entirely. The closest I can get is this. In 2003, I was called to a residential collapse in Marion County. A deck had come off the back of a house during a family gathering. 9 people fell 12 feet. 2 of them were children. I found the failure in 40 minutes. The deck had been attached to the house with nails instead of bolts. A mistake that will hold beautifully for years, right up until the moment it doesn't. And when I got underneath it, and put my flashlight on the ledger board, I found something that has stayed with me for 20 years. The nails had been pulling out for a long time. You could see it. There were rust trails on the wood, drawn out in long streaks, where each nail had backed out a 1/16 of an inch at a time, season after season, for probably 6 or 7 years. The failure took a decade. The collapse took a second and a half. Sitting at my dining room table at 3 in the morning, with $47,500 of rust trails in front of me, I finally understood that my family had been backing out of the wood for years, and I had been standing on the deck the entire time, admiring the view. I did not cry. I have thought about why, and I think it's because a part of me had already known. Instead, I did something that I think a lot of people would find strange. I got a pen and a fresh sheet of graph paper, and I made a chart. Date, amount, running total, account balance before, account balance after, and a column at the far right, empty, labeled corresponding event. Because here is the thing that 38 years of failure analysis teaches you, and it is the single most important thing I know. A failure is never random. It correlates with load. If a beam cracks, something loaded it. If a foundation shifts, water moved. Nothing in a structure ever just happens. And nothing in a family ever just happens either. Every one of those withdrawals had a reason and a date, and the dates were going to tell me something the amounts couldn't. So I filled in that last column. November, $4,000. I was in rehab after hip surgery. December, $3,500. I was in Cincinnati for a week, visiting Margaret's sister. February, $4,000. Marcus and Priscilla went to Cabo. I remember the photographs. April, $2,000. Nothing. Nothing at all. A perfectly ordinary week. June, $5,000. Priscilla's mother, Vanessa, moved into an assisted living facility in Gahanna. I stopped. I looked at that last line for a long, long time. Because Vanessa had been at Ella's birthday party 3 weeks earlier, standing in the kitchen with a glass of wine, and both of her feet firmly under her, telling her daughter that I seemed perfectly sharp. And she did not live in an assisted living facility. She lived in a very nice condominium in Gahanna. I went and got the notebook Frank had told me to buy, and on the first page, in the top corner, I wrote the date, and then I wrote a single line. Nothing in a structure ever just happens. Then I turned the page, and I began to build my case. I called Marcus on the second Monday in April, and I began the performance. I want to be honest about how hard it was. People imagine that lying is easy and telling the truth is hard, and in my experience, it is entirely the reverse. Lying to a stranger is nothing. Lying to your own son, in the voice you used to read him bedtime stories in, is one of the most physically exhausting things I have ever done. Marcus, I said, and I let my voice sit about half a step slower than normal. Not slurred, not stupid, just tired, slightly behind the beat. I wanted to ask you something, and I've forgotten what it was. Dad, hang on, it'll come back to me. I let 11 full seconds of silence go by. I counted them on the clock above the stove. Dad, are you okay? I'm fine. I'm fine. It was about the tax thing, the property thing. The property taxes? Yes. A pause. That's it. That's the one. When are those due? Do you know? I knew exactly when they were due. I had paid them, personally, on the 6th of February, and I had the canceled check in a folder 11 feet from where I was standing. There was a silence on the other end of the line, and in that silence, I could hear my son's entire nervous system changing gear. They were due in February, Dad, he said, very slowly, very warmly, the way you would speak to someone standing on a ledge. In February. Remember? We talked about it. We had not talked about it. And there it was. The second time he had told me we had discussed something we absolutely had not discussed. Once is a mistake. Twice, 16 days apart, is a method. He was doing the same thing to me that I was doing to him. He was building a record. Every one of these phone calls, I understood suddenly, was going into some file somewhere, some list, some future affidavit. My father is increasingly confused about basic financial obligations. On April 11th, he could not recall when property taxes were due, despite multiple prior conversations. We were two engineers, standing on opposite sides of the same wall, each one quietly drilling. The difference was that I knew we were both drilling, and he thought he was alone. February, I repeated. Well, all right then. Do you want me to handle those going forward? Marcus asked. Casual, light, almost bored. It's no trouble. I could just take that off your plate. Maybe, I said. Let me think about it. Dad, honestly, at this point you shouldn't have to. Let me think about it, I said again, and I let a small note of confusion creep in underneath it, so that the refusal sounded less like a decision and more like an old man losing the thread, which is precisely what I wanted him to hear. I hung up. And then I sat down at the kitchen table, and I wrote in the notebook for 20 minutes. April 11th, 6:52 p.m. to 7:04 p.m. Telephone. We alone. No background voices. I feigned confusion. Property tax deadline. M stated, we talked about it. We did not. Second such fabricated prior conversation. See March 3rd entry. M offered unprompted to assume control of tax payments. Tone, rehearsed. He did not sound surprised by my confusion. He sounded relieved by it. That last line is the one Frank would later circle in red pen and read aloud in a room full of lawyers. He did not sound surprised by my confusion. He sounded relieved by it. Now I want to tell you about the recording, because it is the piece that people always ask about, and because I want to be extremely clear that I did not do it the way people think. I did not hide a camera in a smoke detector. I did not buy a spy pen from the internet. I did not do anything cute, and there is a reason for that. And Frank explained the reason to me, with a level of intensity I had not seen from him before. Ohio, he said, is a one-party consent state, which means you, Walter, may lawfully record any conversation you are a participant in. You do not need their permission. You need only your own. And if I'm not in the room, Frank pointed a thick finger at my chest. Then you are committing a felony, he said. I want to be extremely precise with you, because this is where amateurs destroy themselves. If you plant a device in a room and leave, that is illegal interception. It is a crime. It will get your evidence thrown out, and it will get you charged, and I will have to defend you. And Walter, I will be very annoyed. He wrote it down and slid it across the desk. Be in the room. That's it, he said. That's the whole rule. Be in the room, or be in the conversation, and you're clean. Every single word. So that is what I did. I bought a digital recorder, an ordinary one, the kind a journalism student would use, $49 at an electronics store. And I put a piece of black electrical tape over the little red light, and I carried it in the breast pocket of my cardigan. And I began recording every single conversation I had with my son and his wife. Not selectively. Every one. Frank was adamant about that too. If you record only the incriminating ones, opposing counsel will ask you why. And you'll have to say, because I expected them to incriminate themselves. And now you look like a man who set a trap. But if you record all of them, the boring ones, the pleasant ones, the ones where nothing happens, you're just an elderly man who keeps a log. It's not a trap, it's a habit. It's not a trap, it's a habit. Over the next 9 weeks, I filled 41 hours of audio. And I want to tell you the truth about those 41 hours. Most of them are unbearable. Not because they are cruel, because they are ordinary. There are hours of my son talking about a football game. There are long stretches of Priscilla complaining about a client. There is a beautiful 11-minute recording of Ella explaining to me, in enormous detail, the plot of a book she was reading, and my own voice underneath it saying, "And then what happened?" over and over, in a tone that I did not recognize as my own, until I played it back 6 months later in a conference room and had to leave the table. That is the part nobody tells you. When you set out to document a betrayal, you end up documenting a life, and the life is still there. That is what makes it so heavy. Now, the performance. I want to describe what I actually did, because I think people imagine something theatrical, and it was the exact opposite. It was the smallest possible thing, done consistently, over a very long time. I have spent my career watching structures fail, and I can tell you that no structure fails dramatically at first. It fails in increments so small that a person living inside it adjusts to them without noticing. That is what I imitated. I did not act confused. I introduced very small, very specific defects, at a slow and believable rate, and I let them do the work. Here is exactly what I did. I stopped correcting people. That was the first thing, and it was the most powerful, and it was almost unbearably hard. When Priscilla said something factually wrong, and she said things that were factually wrong constantly, because she was a woman who spoke with total confidence about subjects she knew nothing about, I simply agreed. I nodded. I said, "Is that right?" And I watched something behind her eyes relax by a fraction of an inch. I have never in my life let a wrong number go by. Not one. In 38 years, I corrected engineers, contractors, inspectors, my own bosses, and once, memorably, a state senator. Margaret used to kick me under the table. Letting Priscilla tell me, incorrectly, that a house's value is determined by its square footage, and saying nothing, was harder than the 4-hour cognitive exam. I began repeating myself. Once per visit, maybe twice. I would tell a small story, something about the roses, something about the roof, and then, 11 or 12 minutes later, I would tell it again, in almost exactly the same words. And I would watch Marcus's face while I did it, and I would see him glance at his wife. I got the day of the week wrong, rarely. Perhaps once every 2 weeks, never in a way that mattered. I would arrive on a Sunday and say something about it being Saturday, and then, before anyone could correct me, I would move on. I lost things, small things. My reading glasses, which I would then find in my shirt pocket while Marcus watched, with a self-deprecating little laugh, and I let them help me. That was the hardest one, and it was the most important. And I want anybody watching this, who has ever been treated as less than they are, to understand exactly what it costs. When Marcus put his hand under my elbow on the porch steps, steps I designed, steps whose rise and run I calculated personally, in 1981, I let him. When Priscilla cut my food at a restaurant on Mother's Day, in front of a waiter, without asking, I let her. When Marcus took the car keys out of my hand at the end of an evening, and said, "I'll drive you, Dad," I let him. And I sat in the passenger seat of my own vehicle, on roads I had driven for 40 years, and I looked out the window, and I said, "Thank you, son." And I recorded all of it. Because here is what I understood, in a way that Priscilla never did. A predator does not attack a strong animal. A predator waits for limp. I did not need to convince them I was weak. Weakness is not a thing you argue for. Weakness is a thing you display, once, and then a hunter's own confidence does the rest of the work for you. They wanted so badly for it to be true. They had already invested in it being true. Every time I stumbled, I was not persuading them of something. I was rewarding them. And a man being rewarded stops being careful. By the middle of May, they had stopped being careful. The first real slip came on the second Saturday in May. Priscilla called and invited me to dinner at their house. She had never once, in 14 years, called me herself. It had always been Marcus. Always. I said yes, and I put the recorder in my cardigan pocket, and I drove to New Albany, and I sat at their dining room table and ate a chicken dish that was, in fairness, excellent, and I let the evening unfold. Around 8 o'clock, Priscilla poured me a second glass of wine that I had not asked for. I do not drink much. I have never drunk much. Margaret and I would split a bottle at Christmas, and neither of us would finish our share. Priscilla poured me a second glass, and then, 40 minutes later, a third, and I want you to know that I did not drink any of it. I lifted the glass. I touched it to my lips, and every time she left the room, I poured most of it into the potted ficus beside my chair, which I imagine has been dead for some time now. But I let my voice loosen. I let a sentence trail off. I let myself laugh, a half-second too long, at something Marcus said. And at 9:15, with a plausibly drunk 71-year-old man sitting comfortably at her table, Priscilla put both her elbows on the tablecloth and said, in an extremely warm voice, "Walter, can I ask you something personal? Course, when you and Margaret did your estate planning, did you use a lawyer? Or did you do the online thing?" The table went very quiet. Marcus was looking at his plate. I let 11 seconds pass. I let my eyes drift. "There's a will," I said, vaguely. "Somewhere. Margaret handled it." Which was a lie so enormous that I very nearly laughed. Margaret had handled nothing. I had drafted our estate plan with Frank Delgado in 2009, and updated it twice, and I could have recited the article numbers from memory. Priscilla and Marcus exchanged a look. I saw it in my peripheral vision, and I did not turn my head, because a confused man does not track a glance across a table. "Do you know where it is?" Priscilla asked. "Casual. So casual. Oh, it's in the... There's a box." I frowned. "There's a box somewhere. A safe deposit box? At which bank, Walter?" And I looked up at her, and I let my face go completely, beautifully blank. "I don't know," I said. "Isn't that funny?" Priscilla smiled at me with a warmth that I will remember, I think, for as long as I live. "That's okay," she said. "That's what family is for." I got home at 11:40 that night, and I sat in my car in my own driveway for a long time, with the engine off. Then I went inside, and I took the recorder out of my pocket, and I played back the last 20 minutes. And I listened to my daughter-in-law establishing, on tape, that the owner of an $890,000 property could not remember whether he had a will, where it was, or which bank held it. And I wrote in the notebook, and my hand was completely steady. May 10th, 6:40 p.m., 10:55 p.m., their residence. Present, M.P., children. Upstairs after 8:15. P poured 3 glasses of wine unprompted. I consumed none. P initiated direct questioning re, estate documents, will location, safe deposit box. Marcus did not speak during this exchange. He looked at his plate. He knew it was coming. He has known for some time. They are not improvising. They are executing. Recording preserved. Copy to Frank Monday. I want to tell you about the notebook now, because by the end of May, it had become the most important object in my life, and because I think it is the part of this story that is most useful to anybody watching. Frank had given me one rule about it. Write everything, judge nothing. You are not writing a story, he told me. You are writing a log. The instant you start editorializing, the instant you write, "She was clearly plotting," you've handed opposing counsel a weapon. Write what was said. Write who said it. Write the time. Let the facts do the accusing. Facts are much better at it than you are. So that is what I did. And a strange thing happened. Somewhere around the 5th week, the notebook stopped being a legal exercise and became something else entirely. I began to see the shape. You have to understand. I had spent 9 weeks inside this, in a fog. Every conversation was its own small wound, and when you are being wounded one small cut at a time, you cannot see the pattern, because you are too busy bleeding. But the notebook did not bleed. The notebook simply recorded. And on the 28th of May, I sat down with all of it. The notebook, the bank statements, the graph paper, the audio transcripts I had started typing up myself, badly, on Margaret's old computer, and I laid it out on the dining room table, and I did what I have done 100 times in my career. I built a timeline, left to right, 16 months across the top, every event, plotted, every withdrawal, plotted, every phone call, plotted, and then I stepped back, and I looked at it, and my blood went cold in my body, because the withdrawals did not correlate with Marcus's spending. They did not correlate with vacations or credit card bills or the ordinary financial pressures of a man living beyond his means. They correlated with Vanessa. Every single significant withdrawal from my account came within 11 days of a date that I had written down in the corresponding event column with a question mark next to it, because I hadn't understood why it mattered. Vanessa's move to assisted living, $5,000. Vanessa's medical procedure in Florida, $4,000. Vanessa's insurance issue, $3,500. I sat back in Margaret's chair. Vanessa was 68 years old. Vanessa had walked into her granddaughter's birthday party in March in a pair of heels, carrying a bottle of wine, and had spent the afternoon holding forth about a cruise she was planning to take in the fall. Vanessa was not sick. Vanessa was not in assisted living. Vanessa did not have a medical procedure in Florida, which meant that the $47,500 my son had taken out of my account was not being spent on his mother-in-law. It was being spent on something they had agreed to call his mother-in-law. I picked up the phone, and I called Frank Delgado at 10:40 at night, and when he answered I said, "Frank, it's Walter. I need you to find out where $47,500 went, and I don't think it went to a person." There was a very long pause, and then Frank Delgado said, in a voice I had never heard him use before, "Walter, do not say another word on this phone. Come to my office at 8 tomorrow morning, and bring everything." I did not sleep that night. I walked the house instead. I want to try to describe this, because I think it is the truest thing in this entire story. I went room to room in the dark, and I put my hand on things. I put my hand on the doorframe of Marcus's old bedroom, where I had penciled his height every birthday from 4 to 17, and where the pencil marks are still there, under 2 coats of paint, because I never had the heart to sand them out, and Margaret never asked me to. I put my hand on the banister. I turned on a lathe in the garage in 1983, over 11 weekends, while Margaret brought me coffee and told me I was being ridiculous. I stood in the kitchen, and I looked at the oak table. And I went out the back door, and I stood on the porch in the dark in the cold, and I looked at the east side of the house, where Margaret's roses were just starting to come in, badly pruned, by me, for the 3rd year running. The house was completely silent, 4.5 acres of nothing, not a car for 2 miles. And I stood there, 71 years old, in my bathrobe, on a porch I designed when I was 30, and immortal, and I thought, they think this is a parcel, they think this is square footage, and lot lines, and a number on an appraisal. They think that what they are taking from me is an asset. They have no idea what they are actually reaching for. And in that moment, standing in the dark, something in me went very quiet and very still. I have been around large animals. I grew up on the edge of a farm, and I have seen what a bull looks like in the instant before it decides. There is no snorting. There is no pawing. That is theater, and theater is for animals that are not sure. What actually happens is that everything stops. The head comes up, the eyes go flat and forward, and you understand, with total clarity, that the decision has already been made somewhere behind those eyes, and you are simply the last one to be informed. That is what happened to me on my porch on the 28th of May. I did not rage. I did not weep. I simply stopped being afraid. Frank hired an investigator. Her name was Elena Cruz. She was 44 years old. She had spent 11 years as a financial crimes investigator for the Ohio Attorney General's office before going private. And when she walked into Frank's office on the 29th of May and shook my hand, she looked at me for about 4 seconds and said, "You're the engineer." "I am." "Good," she said, sitting down. "Then I won't have to explain what a paper trail is." I liked her enormously, and immediately. Elena spread my documents across Frank's desk, the bank statements, the notebook, the graph paper timeline, the transcripts, and she went through them without speaking for 11 minutes. Then she looked up. "Mr. Ashford, I want to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I mean it professionally, not as a compliment." She tapped the timeline. "In 11 years at the AG's office, I subpoenaed financial records from hundreds of victims. I never once received documentation this good. Not once. From anybody." "It's a load path analysis," I said. "I don't know what that is." "It means I didn't ask what happened," I said. "I asked what had to happen for this to be what I'm looking at." Elena Cruz smiled slowly. "Yeah," she said. "That's exactly what it is." She took the case, and then she disappeared for 11 days. And in those 11 days, she did what I could not have done in 11 years. Here is what Elena Cruz found. The $4,000 that left my account in November, the month I was in the rehabilitation facility with a new hip and a morphine drip, had gone, 3 days later, in a cashier's check, to an escrow company in Delaware County, Ohio. It was an earnest money deposit on a parcel of land. "Wait," I said. "Keep going," Elena said. "It gets much worse." The land was 2.4 acres on Township Road 118. I sat forward in my chair so fast that Frank put a hand out. "That's my road." "That's your road," Elena agreed. "It's the parcel directly north of yours. It shares your entire northern boundary. Your neighbor, a man named Deacon Pryor, 83 years old, widower, no children, sold it in a private transaction in December." "Deacon sold his land," I said. "Deacon Pryor has lived on that land since Eisenhower. He told me 11 years ago they'd carry him off it." "Yes," Elena said quietly. "They did." She put a document on the desk. Mr. Pryor executed a quitclaim deed on December 19th. He was, at the time, 4 months into a diagnosis of vascular dementia. The deed was witnessed and notarized at his kitchen table. He received $41,000 for 2.4 acres of land with a fair market value, at that time, of approximately $310,000. The room was extremely quiet. "Who bought it?" I asked. Elena turned the document around. The grantee was a limited liability company, Meridian Hollow Holdings, LLC. "And who is Meridian Hollow Holdings?" I asked, and my voice did not sound like mine. Elena laid down 3 more sheets of paper, side by side, like a dealer. Meridian Hollow Holdings, LLC, was registered with the Ohio Secretary of State on the 14th of November, 6 days before the $4,000 left your account. Statutory agent, Grant Whitlock. Sole member on the original filing, Grant Whitlock. The man at the birthday party. The man at the birthday party. She tapped the second sheet. On February 2nd, an amended filing added 2 additional members. Priscilla Ashford, and Marcus Ashford. I looked at my son's name on a state filing document. I looked at it for a long time. Mr. Ashford, Elena said, and her voice was gentler now. Do you want to know what they're building? Yes. She put down the last sheet. It was a preliminary site plan, filed with the Delaware County Planning Office in March, 3 weeks before Ella's birthday party, 3 weeks before Grant Whitlock stood in a kitchen and asked me what I thought about my parcel. The plan showed a residential subdivision, 31 lots, and the property boundary drawn on that site plan did not stop at Deacon Pryor's fence line. It ran straight through the middle of my roses, down past my porch, across the foundation I had over-engineered in 1981, and it stopped at the south edge of my 4.5 acres. The subdivision was designed on 7 acres of land. They only owned 2.4. They can't build it without your property, Elena said. Not this plan. The road access, the retention pond, the utility easement, it all runs through you. Without your 4.5 acres, they have a landlocked 2.4 acres, with a dead man's house on it, and $180,000 of sunk cost. I sat completely still. How much is the project worth? I asked. If it gets built. Elena checked her notes. 31 lots, at a projected sale price of $290,000 each, she said. Gross of $8.9 million. Whitlock's pro forma projects a net developer profit of $2.1 million. $2.1 million. That was the number. That was the actual figure. That was what my son had decided I was worth. Mr. Ashford, Elena said carefully. There's one more thing. She hesitated, and I understood then that everything up to this point had been the easy part. On the 17th of April, an attorney in Westerville was retained to prepare a petition for guardianship over an adult with alleged diminished capacity. She met my eyes. The petition has not been filed, but it has been drafted. It names you, and the proposed guardian is your son. Frank Delgado took his glasses off very slowly. Walter, he said. They didn't need Deacon Pryor's signature. He couldn't remember his own address. He set the glasses down. They practiced on him. I want to tell you what I did that night, because I have never told anybody, and because I think it is the only genuinely weak moment in this entire story, and I refuse to pretend I did not have it. I drove out to Deacon Pryor's place. It was 9 o'clock at night. The house was dark. Deacon had been moved, 4 months earlier, to a memory care facility in Sunbury, and his home sat empty, on 2.4 acres of land that no longer belonged to him. I parked at the end of his gravel drive. I did not get out. Deacon Pryor and I were not close. In 40 years, we had probably had 200 conversations, all of them at the fence line, all of them about weather, deer, or the price of a new tractor tire. He had come to Margaret's funeral. He had stood at the back with his hat in both hands, and he had not said a word to me. And afterward, I found a note in my mailbox in shaky block capitals that said, "She was a fine woman." D. Pryor. He was 83 years old. He had lived on that land since he was 11. And a man had sat at his kitchen table with a pen and taken it from him for 13 cents on the dollar, and Deacon Pryor had probably smiled while he signed, and probably offered the man coffee, and had probably, 4 days later, forgotten it had ever happened. I sat in my car at the end of that driveway, and I put both hands on the wheel, and for about 90 seconds, I was not a structural engineer, or a widower, or a man building a case. I was just an old man, crying in the dark, on a county road. And then I stopped, and I wiped my face with the back of my hand, and I said out loud, to nobody, in a voice that surprised me, "They think we don't feel it happening. That is the thing. That is the whole thing. That is what I want anybody watching this to hear. They don't think we're weak. That's not it. If they thought we were weak, they'd be cruel. And cruelty at least acknowledges that you're there." They think we don't feel it happening. They think the lights are dim. They think you can walk into a man's house and take the floor out from under him, and he'll just stand there smiling, because he's old, and old is another word for gone. I put the car in gear. I drove home, and I began, in earnest, to prepare the collapse. The confession came on the 11th of June, and it happened almost exactly the way Frank predicted it would. Which is to say, it happened because I made it happen, and then simply got out of the way. Frank's theory was elegant. "You've established that you're confused," he said. "That's an asset. But it's a wasting asset, because at some point, they'll stop talking to you at all. They'll just file. So you need to convert it. You need to give them a reason to say the whole thing out loud, in a room, with you in it." "How?" "You give them a deadline they didn't set." He leaned back. "Right now, Walter, they control the timeline. They're comfortable. Comfortable people are careful. You need to make them uncomfortable." "And how do I do that?" Frank Delgado smiled. "You tell them you're selling the house." I called Marcus on the 8th of June. I had rehearsed it 11 times. I had written it out in the notebook, and I still had to sit down at the kitchen table with my hand on the recorder before I could dial. "Marcus," I said, "I've been thinking. Okay, you were right. About the house." I let a long breath out. "It's too much. The stairs, the land." "You were right." There was a silence on the other end that I can only describe as electric. "Dad," he said, and his voice had gone very careful. That's really good. That's really mature of you. So you want to talk about how we—" "I called a realtor," I said. The silence changed completely. "You what?" "A realtor. There's a woman. She's got the signs all over Powell. I called her Tuesday." I paused. "She's coming out on the 15th to look at the place. She thinks we could list by August." "Dad." His voice had climbed half an octave. "Dad, no." "Dad, hang on. Who? Who did you call?" "I don't remember her name," I said. "It's on a card. It's around here somewhere." "Dad, listen to me. Do not— Priscilla is a realtor. Priscilla sells houses. Why on earth would you call a stranger?" "Oh," I said. "That's true, isn't it?" I let 11 seconds go by. "I forgot," I said. "I have replayed that recording, and I want to tell you that you can hear it. You can actually hear it happen. There is a sound my son makes, a small, sharp intake of breath, and then his voice comes back completely different, faster, tighter, the voice of a man watching a train move that he thought he had the brakes on. Dad, don't do anything. Don't sign anything with this woman. Don't, okay? We're coming out. Priscilla and I are coming out on Saturday. We'll sit down, we'll go through everything, and we'll do this properly. Okay? Family first. Family first, I agreed. I hung up. And then I called Frank Delgado, and I said, "It's Saturday. They're coming Saturday." And Frank said, "Walter, listen very carefully. This is the most dangerous day of your life. If you get greedy, if you push, if you let them see one flash of the man you actually are, this all goes away. Do you understand me? You do nothing. You say nothing. You sit in a chair, and you let them talk. Frank, say it back to me. I sit in a chair, and I let them talk." "Good," he said. "And Walter, record from the moment they pull in the driveway. Saturday, the 11th of June. They arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon. I want to set the scene for you exactly, because I designed this house, and I know every sightline in it, and what I did that day was a piece of engineering. The kitchen and the dining room are separated by a wall with a wide cased opening. Off the kitchen, on the north side, is the pantry. A walk-in, 6 feet by 4 feet, with a door that does not latch properly, and has not latched properly since 1994, because I never got around to planing it. If you stand in the pantry with the door pulled to within an inch, you can hear every word spoken in the kitchen, perfectly. I know this because Margaret used to hide in there to eat cookies, and I used to catch her doing it, and she used to say, the pantry was the only place in the house where a woman could have a private thought. Here is what I did. At 2 o'clock, I put a glass of water on the kitchen table. I turned the radio on low in the living room, and I put the recorder, running, in the breast pocket of my cardigan. And when Marcus and Priscilla arrived, I let them in, and I sat with them at the kitchen table for 40 minutes, and I let them explain to me, very slowly and very kindly, all the reasons why selling my house through a stranger was dangerous. I'm going to get more water, I said. Excuse me, and I walked into the kitchen, and I turned the tap on. Running water, loud, a man clearly occupied. And then I stepped sideways into the pantry, and I pulled the door to within an inch, and I stood in the dark, 6 feet from my son, with a digital recorder running in my pocket, and I did not move. I was in the room. I was in the house. I was in the adjoining space. I was, under the law of the state of Ohio, 4.5 feet from the participants, and entirely within the environment of the conversation. Frank had walked me through this in his office, with a floor plan and a highlighter, and had said the words, "You are present," out loud, 11 times. The tap ran. I waited. And after about 40 seconds, Priscilla said, "Is he in the bathroom?" "Kitchen," Marcus said. "He's fine. He does this. He'll be in there for 10 minutes. A chair scraped. And then my daughter-in-law lowered her voice, and I heard the exact tone she uses when she is closing. And she said, "Marcus, he called a realtor." "I know. He called a realtor." Her voice was tight and controlled and absolutely furious. "Do you understand what happens if a licensed agent walks this property? She pulls comps. She pulls the plat map. She sees a 31-lot preliminary plan filed on the adjoining parcel, and she tells him his land is worth 2.5 times what he thinks it is. And then, Marcus, then he is not a confused old man with a big empty house. He is a very well-informed seller, sitting on the only thing standing between Grant Whitlock and $2.1 million. I know, Pris. Do you? Because we have $184,000 in this. A pause. $184,000, Marcus. 47.5 of which came out of that man's checking account, which, and I want you to hear this, is a fact that becomes extremely interesting to a prosecutor the moment anyone starts asking questions. I stood in the dark in my pantry. I did not move. I did not breathe. 38 years of standing under buildings that wanted to fall on me had taught me exactly one physical skill, and it is this. When the structure starts to move, you do not run. You go still, and you listen, and you let it tell you what it's going to do. Nobody's asking questions, Marcus said. Not yet. Pris, say it, she said. Say the whole thing out loud, Marcus, because I am tired of you pretending you fell into this. Say what we're doing. And there was a pause. And then my son, who I taught to ride a bicycle on Cedar Lane, who I paid 5 years of tuition for, who cried on my shoulder at his own wedding, said the following. I have the transcript. I have read it more times than is healthy. I am going to give it to you, word for word. We file the guardianship petition. Bergstrom says we've got enough. The tax thing, the will thing, the realtor thing is actually perfect. It's exactly the kind of impulsive financial decision they look for. We file, we get a temporary emergency order, and I get appointed guardian of the estate. Then the house is mine to manage. I execute the transfer to Meridian Hollow at fair market value, which is whatever an appraiser we pay says it is, and the whole parcel closes by October. And him. And he goes to Brightview, Marcus said. It's a nice place, Pris. It's a genuinely nice place. He'll have people around. He'll have... Don't do that, Priscilla said sharply. Don't do the voice. Not with me. You want to do it for the judge, fine, I'll hold your hand. But not in this kitchen. And there was a silence. And then my son said, very quietly, he'd give it to me anyway, if I asked. If I just asked him, he'd give me the house. Then ask him, Priscilla said. I can't. A chair moved. Because then, I'd have to look at him while he said yes. And I stood in the dark, 6 feet away, in a pantry, with a door I never planed, and I closed my eyes. Because that right there, is the sentence. Not the guardianship. Not the 2.1 million. Not the 47,500. He knew. He knew that if he had walked into my kitchen and said, Dad, I'm in trouble. I need help. I made a bad investment, and I'm $184,000 deep, and I'm frightened. He knew what I would have done. He knew I would have given him the house. And he chose to steal it instead, because taking it from a competent man would have required him to watch my face while I handed it over. That was the crack. That was the first fracture. The one that happened years before anything visible. The one that everything else grew out of. My son did not steal from me because he thought I would say no. He stole from me because he knew I would say yes, and he could not bear to be a man who took it. I stood in that pantry for another 4 minutes, while they talked about school districts, and retention ponds, and a man named Bergstrom. Then I turned the tap off, and I walked out into my kitchen with a glass of water in my hand, and I sat back down at the table, where my wife had rolled out pie crust for 31 years, and I smiled at my son, and I said, Now, what were we talking about? And Marcus Ashford smiled back at me and said, Nothing important, Dad. Frank Delgado listened to the recording on a Monday morning, with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes closed. When it finished, he did not speak for a long time. Then he opened his eyes, and he said, Walter, I want you to understand what you just handed me. Tell me. That is a recorded admission of a conspiracy to commit theft from a person in a protected class, obtained lawfully by a participant present in the environment of the conversation, in a one-party consent state. He held up a finger for each item. That is an admission that $47,500 was converted from your account. That is an admission that a guardianship petition is being prepared in bad faith, for the specific purpose of transferring your property. That is an admission of a below-market self-dealing transfer to an entity they control. He paused. And it's on tape, in their own voices, in your house. He sat back. In 29 years, Frank said, I have never seen a cleaner piece of evidence. Then he took his glasses off. And now, he said, I have to tell you the worst thing I've ever had to tell a client. I waited. We can't use it yet, Frank said. Not the way you want to. Frank, listen to me. He leaned forward. If we go to the police today, here's what happens. They open a case. It takes months. Meanwhile, Marcus is still a signatory on your account, and still the son of a man they will describe, in court, as having called a realtor he can't remember and forgotten when his taxes were due. And Bergstrom files that guardianship petition the second he smells this coming. Because the fastest way to discredit an accuser, Walter, is to have a judge declare that he's incompetent. He let that land. It becomes a race, Frank said. And in a race between a criminal investigation and an emergency guardianship petition, the petition wins. Every time. Because it's faster, and because probate courts are terrified of getting it wrong in the other direction. I sat in that chair, and I felt everything I had built for 3 months start to tilt. So what do I do? Frank Delgado put his glasses back on. You stop being the victim of a crime, he said, and you start being the plaintiff in one. He pulled out a legal pad. Here's what we're going to do. What Frank Delgado laid out on that legal pad took 11 weeks to execute, and I am going to walk you through it, because I think it is the most useful thing in this entire story. Anybody can be betrayed. very few people know what to actually do about it. Step 1. I removed the exposure. Quietly. On the 14th of June, I walked into my bank on Sawmill Road, and I sat down with a branch manager, and I did 4 things. I removed Marcus as a signatory on my checking account. It took 11 minutes and required no explanation and no permission. She simply printed a form, and I signed it, and it was done. I want to stop here, because I think a great many people watching this have someone on an account who should not be there, and they have been putting it off for years because they cannot face the conversation. There is no conversation. That is the thing nobody tells you. You do not have to justify it. You do not have to announce it. You walk in, you say, "I would like to remove an authorized signer," and the bank does it, because it is your money, and it has always been your money. Second, I opened a new account at a different institution entirely, and I moved my direct deposits. Third, I filed a written revocation of the durable power of attorney that Marcus had held since 2019, a document I had genuinely forgotten existed until Frank asked, and which, had they filed the guardianship petition, would have handed him control of my medical decisions the same afternoon. And fourth, on Frank's instruction, I did something I would never have thought of in 1,000 years. I filed a durable power of attorney and an advance healthcare directive naming Frank Delgado. Not because I want it, Frank said, because a vacancy is an invitation. If a probate judge looks at Walter Ashford and sees no plan, no attorney, no designated agent, that judge sees a man who needs a guardian. If that judge looks at Walter Ashford and sees a current, valid, attorney-drafted power of attorney executed 11 weeks before the petition was filed, alongside a 22-page neuropsych evaluation, putting him in the 94th percentile, he smiled. Then that judge sees a man who is being harvested. Step 2. We went to the county prosecutor, but not the way you think. Frank did not walk into a police station. He made a phone call to a woman named Deputy Chief Assistant Prosecutor Rhonda Sayers, who ran the Economic Crimes Unit for the county, and he said 11 words that I will remember for the rest of my life. "Rhonda, it's Frank Delgado. I have an elder financial exploitation case with a recorded confession and a paper trail an accountant could follow in the dark, and I think you're going to want the second victim more than the first. The second victim, Deacon Pryor, because here is what I had not fully understood, sitting in my car crying at the end of that driveway. I was not the case. I was a witness in a much bigger one. My son and his wife and Grant Whitlock had taken an 83-year-old man with vascular dementia, sat him at his own kitchen table, and bought 2.4 acres of land worth $310,000 for $41,000. That is not a family dispute. That is not a probate matter. That is felony exploitation of an elderly person under Ohio law, and it carries real time. And I had documented it, not because I meant to, because I had followed the load path, and the load path went straight through Deacon Pryor's kitchen. Elena Cruz found 7 more. That is the part I still have trouble saying out loud. Once Rhonda Sayers's office opened a formal investigation and subpoenaed Meridian Hollow Holdings, Elena went back through Grant Whitlock's history, and Grant Whitlock had a history. Between 2016 and that spring, Grant Whitlock had been a member, manager, or statutory agent of 11 different limited liability companies. 9 of them had acquired real property. 7 of those 9 acquisitions had come from sellers over the age of 78. 4 of those 7 sellers had been dead within 2 years of the sale. 3 of them had signed under a power of attorney held by a family member who was, in every single case, also a member of the acquiring entity. The pattern was so clean, it was almost beautiful. In the way a stress fracture is beautiful, when you finally see it under a light. Grant Whitlock did not find land. He found families. He found a middle-aged son or daughter with money trouble, and a parent with property, and he offered them a way to convert one into the other, and he took the developer's cut, and he let the family carry the guilt. He had done it 7 times. My son was number 8, and Marcus. I want to be very precise about this, because it is the only mercy in this entire story, and I have thought about whether it is a mercy at all. Marcus did not know about the other 7. I know that because I heard it. Later, on a different recording, in a different room, in a sentence he said with real horror in his voice. He thought he was the only one. He thought Grant Whitlock was a friend from a golf course, who had a good idea about a subdivision. He was a mark. He was recruited, and groomed, and financially entangled, and then handed a shovel. That does not excuse him. Let me be extremely clear about that, because I know exactly how this sounds. He was 43 years old. He sat in my kitchen and planned my institutionalization. He took $47,500 out of my account while I was under anesthesia. But there is a difference between a man who builds a machine and a man who agrees to be a part in one. And when the sentencing came, that difference was worth 11 years. Step 3. We let them file. This was Frank's idea, and when he said it, I told him he was insane. You want me to let my son go to a probate court and tell a judge I'm incompetent? Yes, Frank said. Frank, why? And Frank Delgado leaned across the desk, and he said the sentence, that is, I think, the single smartest thing anybody said to me in the entire 11 months of this. Because right now, Walter, everything they've done is deniable. He held up his hands. The $47,500? He was a signatory. He'll say you gave him permission and forgot. The recording? He'll say it was locker room talk. Hypotheticals. A stressed man venting to his wife. The LLC? Perfectly legal. The prior purchase? He'll say he wasn't involved. That was Whitlock. He just invested. He put his hands down. Every single piece of it has an innocent explanation, and a good defense attorney will give a jury 11 of them. Do you understand? Right now they can still walk this back. So what changes? They file, Frank said. The moment your son signs a sworn affidavit and files it with the Delaware County Probate Court, stating that his father is of unsound mind and incapable of managing his own affairs. He tapped the desk. He has committed a felony in writing, under oath, with a file stamp on it. And we have a 22-page neuropsychological evaluation, dated 4 months before that filing, that puts you in the 94th percentile. He sat back. You want him to stop being a man who took money from his father, Frank said. You want him to become a man who lied to a judge. Judges are very forgiving about the first one, Walter. They are not forgiving about the second. I did not sleep for 2 nights, because I understood what he was asking me to do. He was asking me to stand still, and let my son load the gun, and let him raise it, and let him put his finger on the trigger, because the crime was not the bullet. The crime was the aim, and the only way to prove the aim was to let him take it. On the 9th of August, my son filed a sworn petition with the Delaware County Probate Court. He alleged that I, Walter Ashford, 71, was incapable of managing my property by reason of progressive cognitive decline consistent with early-stage dementia. He submitted 11 pieces of supporting evidence. An affidavit from himself, describing my confusion about property taxes. An affidavit from Priscilla, describing my increasing memory lapses and my impulsive decision to engage an unknown realtor. An affidavit from Vanessa, Priscilla's mother, describing me as disoriented at her granddaughter's birthday party. A statement from a neighbor 2 miles down the road who had spoken to me perhaps 4 times in his life. Photographs of my unkempt garden. That last one is the one that I have never gotten over. They photographed Margaret's roses. They took pictures of the roses that I had been pruning badly for 3 years, and they put them in a court filing as evidence that I could no longer care for myself. I sat in Frank's office, and I looked at those photographs, and Frank said, very quietly, "Walter," and I said, "They don't know why they're crooked. Because Margaret pruned those roses for 31 years. And every spring since she died, I have gone out there in April with her green-handled shears and done a worse job than she did. And I have done it anyway, every single year, badly, because it is 11 minutes a year when my hands are doing what her hands did." They photographed my grief and filed it as a symptom. That was the moment. Not the pantry, not the bank statements, not the $2.1 million. That was the moment I stopped having any interest whatsoever in Mercy. The hearing was set for the 22nd of September, and Frank Delgado did something so precise and so quiet that Priscilla did not understand what had happened to her until she was standing in the courtroom. He did not oppose the petition. He filed a response, a single-page acknowledgement, entering an appearance on my behalf and confirming that I would appear and testify at the hearing. That is all. No motion to dismiss, no counter-evidence, no neuropsychological report, nothing, nothing at all. "They're going to think you have nothing," Frank said. "They're going to think I'm not fighting. They're going to think," Frank said, "that they've already won. And Walter, a man who thinks he has already won, stops looking behind him." Rhonda Sayers's office made one request. She asked us to say nothing, file nothing, and produce nothing until the 22nd of September. Because on the 18th of September, 4 days before my hearing, a grand jury in Delaware County was scheduled to consider the case of the state of Ohio versus Grant Whitlock, and Rhonda Sayers had one specific thing she wanted. She wanted Marcus and Priscilla Ashford to walk into that probate courtroom on the 22nd of September, fully confident, completely unaware, and legally exposed, with a sworn perjured affidavit already on file. "There's a reason we do it in that order," she told me in her office, a small woman with gray in her hair and 11 years of this behind her eyes. "Mr. Ashford, I want you to understand something. In my experience, the hardest part of an elder exploitation case is never the evidence. It's that the victim testifies, and the family sits there, and the jury looks at a 70-year-old man contradicting his own son, and some part of them thinks, well, maybe he is confused." She folded her hands. "That doubt is the whole defense. That doubt is the only thing they've got. So how do we kill it?" Rhonda Sayers smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who has spent a career watching bad people underestimate good ones. "We let them prove you're incompetent," she said, "in a courtroom, on the record, under oath. And then we let you answer." The night before the hearing, Marcus called me. "I want to tell you about this call, because it is the only part of this story that still, a full year later, wakes me up at 3 in the morning. It was 11:40 at night. I was in bed. My phone rang. "Dad?" His voice was wrong, thick. "Marcus, it's late." I know it is." A long pause, and then, very quietly, "Dad, do you know what tomorrow is?" And I sat up in the dark in my bedroom, in the house I built, and I made the hardest decision of the entire 11 months. "It's Thursday," I said. The silence went on for a very long time, and then my son said, in a voice I had not heard since he was 17 years old, and had wrecked my car, and called me from the side of a road, Yeah, it's Thursday." Another silence. "Dad, I need you to know, whatever happens, I need you to know that I love you, okay? I need you to know that." And there it was. He was saying goodbye. He was calling his father, The night before he stood in a courtroom and swore under oath that his father's mind was gone, and he was saying goodbye, to me, to the man he thought was already halfway gone, in a way that he thought was safe, because he thought I would not remember it in the morning. He was confessing to a man he believed could not hear him. And I sat in the dark with the phone against my ear, and I felt something in my chest that I am not going to be able to explain to you, because there is not a word for it in English. He loved me. That is the thing. He was not lying. He loved me, completely and genuinely. And he was going to do it anyway. And he had built himself a version of me that was already gone, so that he could survive the doing of it. I could have ended it right there. I want you to understand that. One sentence. Marcus, I know all of it. Stop. He would have stopped. He would have collapsed in his kitchen and wept and confessed, and Priscilla would have taken the children, and he would have kept his freedom, and I would have kept my son, and we would have both spent the rest of our lives pretending. I did not say it, and I have gone back and forth for a year on whether that makes me a good man or a hard one, and I have not settled it, and I do not expect to. What I said was, "Good night, son," and I hung up the phone, and I lay in the dark in Margaret's house, and I did not sleep at all. At 4 a.m, I got up and I went downstairs, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I opened the notebook to a blank page, and I wrote, September 22nd, 4:10 a.m. He called last night. He said he loves me. I believe him. That is the load. That is the whole load, right there. And a load does not care whether you love the beam. The Delaware County Probate Court, Courtroom 2, on the 22nd of September. I arrived at 8:40 in the morning, wearing a charcoal suit that Margaret bought me in 2011 for a wedding, and a tie she picked out, and I sat in the second row on the left-hand side, with Frank Delgado beside me. The room was not large. Probate courtrooms never are. There is no jury box, because there is no jury. There is a bench, and 2 tables, and 4 rows of hard wooden pews, and a court reporter, and a bailiff, and that is all. There were more people in that room than I expected. Marcus and Priscilla, at the petitioner's table, with a lawyer named Bergstrom, a soft, expensively dressed man of about 50, with a leather folio and an air of complete boredom, because to him, this was a routine, uncontested guardianship on a Thursday morning. Vanessa, in the front row behind them, in a navy dress. Grant Whitlock, in the 3rd row on the right, in a gray sport coat. He came. That is the part I still find remarkable. Grant Whitlock came to watch, because the entire $2.1 million turned on this hearing, and because he was a man who had done this 7 times and had never once been in a room where it went wrong. And in the back row, in an ordinary dark suit, with a legal pad on her knee and no expression on her face at all, sat Deputy Chief Assistant Prosecutor Rhonda Sayers. Nobody looked at her twice. The judge was a woman named Judge Adeze Kimball. She was, I would guess, 60. She had been on the probate bench for 19 years, and she had the specific, weary, absolutely unfoolable quality of a person who has watched families destroy each other over furniture for 2 decades. She called the case at 9:04, and Bergstrom stood up and began, and I sat there with my hands folded and I let him. He was good. I want to be fair to him. He was smooth and unhurried, and he never once raised his voice. He described a man in cognitive decline. He described the property tax confusion. He described the realtor. He read from Priscilla's affidavit. Increasing memory lapses, impulsive financial decisions, vulnerable to exploitation by outside parties. And I sat 11 feet away and listened to my daughter-in-law's words in another man's mouth. He submitted the photographs of Margaret's roses. Judge Kimball looked at them for a long moment. She did not comment. Then Bergstrom called Marcus, and my son stood up and walked to the witness stand and put his hand on a Bible and swore to tell the truth. I watched him do it. I watched my son raise his right hand in a courtroom 11 feet from me and swear an oath, and then sit down in a wooden chair and, in a calm and sorrowful voice, tell a judge of the state of Ohio that his father's mind was failing. He was good at it too. That is the thing that will stay with me. He did not overplay. He did not weep. He spoke slowly, with long pauses, the way a genuinely heartbroken man speaks. He said, "This is the hardest thing I've ever done." He said, "He's my dad." He said, "I just want him safe." He said, "We talked about it, twice. And once, he looked directly at me. I made my eyes go soft and slightly unfocused, and I gave him a small, warm, entirely uncomprehending smile. And I watched something behind my son's face die. He looked away. Bergstrom finished at 9:41. "Your Honor," he said, "the petitioner rests. Given the medical documentation and the family testimony, we'd ask the court to enter an emergency temporary order today, with a full guardianship hearing to follow." Judge Kimball looked at her file. "Mr. Delgado," she said, "you've entered an appearance for the respondent, but you haven't filed anything. Do you wish to be heard?" And Frank Delgado stood up and buttoned his jacket and said, "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Ashford would like to testify on his own behalf." There was a small movement at the petitioner's table. Bergstrom's head came up. "Your Honor," he said, and there was a note in his voice now, a small one. "With respect, I'd caution the court. Given the respondent's condition, subjecting him to direct examination could be quite distressing for him, and I'm not sure it serves." "Mr. Bergstrom," Judge Kimball said, without looking up, "you have just spent 37 minutes telling me this man cannot manage his own affairs. He has an absolute statutory right to be heard on that question in my courtroom. Sit down." Bergstrom sat down, and I stood up. I walked to the witness stand. I did it slowly. I put a hand on the rail as I climbed the single step, because I am 71, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. And I sat down in the chair, and I raised my right hand, and I swore to tell the truth. And then Frank Delgado said, "State your name for the record." And I said, "Walter James Ashford." "Mr. Ashford, how old are you?" 71. "What did you do for a living?" "I was a structural engineer for 38 years. My last 11 years, I specialized in forensic structural analysis." "What is forensic structural analysis?" "It's what you call a man," I said, "after something has already fallen down." I let that sit, and then I turned, very slightly, in the chair, and I looked directly at my son at the petitioner's table, and I dropped the mask. I have thought a great deal about how to describe what happened in that room in the next 4 seconds. And I have decided that the truest thing I can say is that I did not do anything dramatic at all. I simply stopped performing. My spine straightened by perhaps an inch. My hands went still on the rail, and my eyes went flat, and forward, and completely, absolutely clear. That was all. And I watched my son's face come apart. I have seen buildings fail. I have stood 11 feet from a masonry wall the moment it lost integrity. And there is a thing that happens, in the instant before the collapse, that engineers talk about and laymen never see. The whole structure goes still. Every crack stops moving. It is a fraction of a second of absolute, perfect silence. And then it comes down all at once. That is what Marcus Ashford's face did in the Delaware County Probate Court on the 22nd of September. "Mr. Ashford," Frank said, "when are your property taxes due?" "The first half is due by the 20th of February, I said. "The second half by the 20th of July. I have paid them on the 6th of February and the 11th of July, respectively, every year for the last 19 years. I have the cancelled checks. They're in Exhibit C. Bergstrom stood up. Objection. There's been no exhibit. There is now, Frank said, and put a bound folder on the clerk's desk. Respondents' Exhibits A through R, Your Honor. Filed this morning.
R, Judge Kimball said. R, Your Honor.
She opened it. Mr. Ashford, Frank continued, on the 18th of April of this year, did you undergo a neuropsychological evaluation?
I did.
4 hours and 20 minutes. At the Ohio Neurocognitive Institute, administered by Dr. Amara Osei, board certified in clinical neuropsychology. And what did that evaluation find? I looked at the judge. It found that my cognitive function is in the superior range across every domain assessed, I said. It placed my executive function and abstract reasoning at the 94th percentile relative to men my age. It found, and I am quoting, Your Honor, no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment. The courtroom was completely silent. That evaluation is Exhibit A, Frank said. It is dated the 18th of April. The petition before this court was filed on the 9th of August. Your Honor will note that the medical evidence predates the petition by nearly 4 months. Judge Adeze Kimball raised her head very slowly and looked at the petitioner's table. She did not say anything. She just looked at them. And Bergstrom, who had walked into that courtroom with a leather folio and a routine Thursday, turned his head and looked at his own client with an expression I would call the beginning of professional terror. Mr. Ashford, Frank said, did you call a realtor? I did. Why? Because I wanted my son to believe I was about to sell the house, I said, so that he and his wife would be forced to discuss their plans out loud within my hearing. Priscilla Ashford stood up. She actually stood up, in a courtroom, and said, That's not. Ma'am, said the bailiff. She sat down. Mr. Ashford, Frank said, on the 11th of June, were you present in your home during a conversation between your son and his wife? I was. Where in the home? In my pantry, I said, which shares an open wall with my kitchen. I was approximately 4.5 feet from the participants. I designed the house. I know the acoustics. Somebody in the back of the courtroom made a sound. Were you recording? I was. I have recorded every conversation I have had with my son and his wife since the 4th of April. 41 hours of audio. I did so on the advice of counsel. In a one-party consent state, as a participant present in the environment of every conversation recorded. Your Honor, Bergstrom said, and he was on his feet now, and his voice had gone up. I'm going to object very strongly. To what? Judge Kimball said. To this entire. Your Honor, this is a guardianship hearing. Yes, she said. It is. And you ask me to strip this man of his rights on the grounds that he cannot understand his own affairs. She looked back at me. I'm finding that a difficult proposition, Mr. Bergstrom. Sit down. Frank Delgado turned to the bench. Your Honor, respondent moves to admit Exhibit K, a certified transcript with authenticating affidavit of a recording made on the 11th of June at the respondent's residence. Any objection to authenticity, Mr. Bergstrom? Bergstrom opened his mouth, and then he closed it, because he had not heard the recording, and because he did not know what was on it, and because in that moment he understood, I watched him understand, that his own clients had not told him what was on it either. No objection to authenticity, Your Honor, he said quietly. Admitted, said Judge Kimball. Play it. Frank Delgado pressed a button, and my daughter-in-law's voice filled the Delaware County Probate Court. Do you understand what happens if a licensed agent walks this property? She pulls comps. She pulls the plat map. She sees a 31-lot preliminary plan filed on the adjoining parcel. I did not watch the recording. There is nothing to watch. I watched the room. I watched Vanessa's face lose its color in stages, like a wall in a fire. I watched Grant Whitlock, in the third row, go completely, unnaturally still, and then, very slowly, very casually, begin to gather his jacket. I watched Bergstrom put down his pen and close his eyes. And I watched my son sit at that table, with his hands flat in front of him, and his shoulders down, and his chin up, staring straight ahead at nothing, listening to his own voice come out of a speaker in a courtroom. $184,000, Marcus, 47.5 of which came out of that man's checking account. Judge Kimball's head came up. We file the guardianship petition. Bergstrom says we've got enough. Bergstrom's eyes opened. I get appointed guardian of the estate. Then the house is mine to manage. I execute the transfer to Meridian Hollow at fair market value, which is whatever an appraiser we pay says it is. And then, in the silence of that courtroom, 71 seconds in, my son's recorded voice said, he'd give it to me anyway, if I asked. If I just asked him, he'd give me the house. Then ask him. I can't. Because then I'd have to look at him while he said yes. Frank Delgado stopped the recording. Nobody moved. Judge Adeze Kimball sat on her bench, and she looked down at the petitioner's table for what I would estimate was 11 full seconds. And then she said, in a voice like a door closing, Mr. Marcus Ashford, please stand. He stood. On the 9th of August of this year, you signed a sworn affidavit and filed it with this court. In that affidavit, you stated, under penalty of perjury, that your father suffers from progressive cognitive decline, consistent with early-stage dementia, and that he is incapable of managing his property. She paused. Was that statement true? The silence went on for a very, very long time. And my son, 43 years old, in a suit, in front of his wife and his mother-in-law, and a judge, and his father, said, No, Your Honor. Say it again. It wasn't true. Did you know it wasn't true when you signed it? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Kimball nodded once. Mr. Bergstrom, she said, does your client wish to withdraw the petition? Yes, Your Honor, Bergstrom said, and his voice was hollow. The petition is dismissed with prejudice, Judge Kimball said. The respondent is restored to the full and unrestricted management of his affairs, which, for the record, he never lost, and which this court finds he is manifestly capable of exercising. She closed the file, and then she said, Bailiff, secure the courtroom. Nobody leaves. Grant Whitlock was already standing. He got 4 steps. The rear doors of courtroom 2 opened, and 2 Delaware County Sheriff's deputies came through them, and behind them came Rhonda Sayers, who stood up from the back row, and buttoned her jacket, and walked up the center aisle in complete silence. Your Honor, she said, Rhonda Sayers, Delaware County Prosecutor's Office, Economic Crimes. I apologize for the interruption. You don't look terribly apologetic, Miss Sayers. No, Your Honor. She turned around. Grant Whitlock, she said. On the 18th of September, a Delaware County grand jury returned a 19-count indictment against you. Counts 1 through 7, theft from a person in a protected class. Counts 8 through 14, forgery. Counts 15 through 18, engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity. Count 19, conspiracy. She nodded to the deputies. You have the right to remain silent. Grant Whitlock did not say a word. I want the record to reflect that. He did not protest. He did not object. He did not look at Marcus or Priscilla or anybody else. He simply put his hands behind his back, like a man who had rehearsed it, and he let them lead him out, and he did not turn around. 7 other families. He never turned around for any of them either. Rhonda Sayers turned back to the petitioner's table. Priscilla was already crying. Not quietly. Marcus Ashford, Priscilla Ashford, you are both under arrest. And that is when my daughter-in-law looked at me. Across a courtroom, past her own attorney, past the deputies, past everything, She looked directly at me, and her face was absolutely wrecked and absolutely furious, and she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "You planned this. You sat in my house, and you planned this. You lied to us." And the room went quiet, waiting for me to answer. And I sat in the witness box, 71 years old, in the suit my wife bought me, and I looked at the woman who had photographed my wife's roses and filed them as evidence of my decay. "No," I said. "You told me what I was. For 6 months, you told me exactly what I was. In my own house, at my own table. I stood up. I just stopped arguing with you. I am going to give you the numbers, because I promised myself that if I ever told this story, I would not be vague about the ending. Vagueness is a kindness to the guilty." Grant Whitlock went to trial in March. It lasted 11 days. The jury was out for 4 hours. He was convicted on 17 of 19 counts. Theft from a person in a protected class, 7 counts. Forgery, 6 counts. Engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity, 3 counts. Conspiracy, 1 count. Judge Marcus Halloran sentenced him to 22 years in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, with parole eligibility at 18. He was 51 years old. The court entered a restitution order of $4,180,000, distributed among the estates and surviving families of the 8 sellers. Deacon Pryor's 2.4 acres were returned to him by court order in April. He did not understand what had happened. He was, by then, entirely gone. He died in June, in the memory care facility in Sunbury, at 84. I was there. I want you to know that. I sat with him for the last 2 afternoons of his life, and I read him the farm report out of the newspaper, because he liked the sound of it, and he did not know who I was. I went to his funeral. 11 people came. His land, the 2.4 acres he was born on, was sold by his estate, and by the terms of his will, which had been drafted in 1997, when he was still entirely himself, the proceeds went to the Delaware County 4-H. Deacon Pryor had no children. He left everything to other peoples. Priscilla Ashford pleaded guilty in January to 1 count of theft from a person in a protected class, 1 count of forgery, and 1 count of complicity to commit perjury. She was sentenced to 6 years. She served, in the end, 4 years and 2 months. She lost her real estate license permanently. The Ohio Division of Real Estate revoked it in a proceeding that took, I am told, about 11 minutes. Marcus, my son, pleaded guilty in January. He pleaded to everything. He refused a plea agreement that would have reduced his exposure, against the advice of his own attorney, and he stood up in front of Judge Halloran, and he entered an open plea, which means he pleaded guilty with no deal and no promises, and put himself entirely at the mercy of the court. Complicity to commit theft from a person in a protected class. Complicity to commit forgery, perjury, attempted theft. The sentencing hearing was on the 14th of February. I was asked, as the victim, whether I wished to make a statement. And I want to tell you what happened, because I have never told anyone. I stood up in that courtroom, and I looked at my son in an orange jumpsuit, 44 years old by then, and I opened my mouth to read the statement I had written, and I had written 11 drafts of it, and it was 4 pages long, and it was very good, and it was completely, entirely true. And I could not do it. I stood there for about 20 seconds, with 4 pages in my hand, and then I folded them, and I put them in my jacket pocket, and I said, "Your Honor, I have a statement, and I'm not going to read it." Judge Halloran looked at me. "Mr. Ashford, you're entitled to be heard." "I know. Do you want the court to know anything?" And I looked at Marcus. "Yes," I said. "I'd like the court to know that when he was 7 years old, he saved a bird. It hit our kitchen window, and he sat with it in a shoebox in the garage for 2 days, and he fed it with an eyedropper, and it lived." I paused, And I'd like the court to know that he took $47,500 out of my account while I was under anesthesia. The room was extremely quiet. Both of those things are true, I said. I've spent a year trying to make one of them cancel the other, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. I looked at the judge. I'm not going to ask you to be lenient, I said. It isn't my job, and I'd be doing it for me, not for him. He knew what he was doing. He said so in my kitchen. He should be sentenced for what he actually did. I sat down. Judge Halloran sentenced Marcus Ashford to 11 years, with judicial release eligibility after 7. The restitution order against my son was $141,000. They recovered $481,000 in total from the Meridian Hollow Holdings accounts and the forced liquidation of the LLC's assets. My portion, after the other 7 families were made whole, was $306,000. Grant Whitlock's 2.4 acres, the parcel he took from Deacon Pryor, went back to Deacon's estate. The subdivision was never built. The preliminary plat was withdrawn by the Delaware County Planning Office in May. Township Road 118 is still a soybean field and a tree line. And I still live in my house. Now I want to tell you about the money, and then I am going to stop. $306,000. I did not need it. That is the strange, hollow, entirely unexpected thing about all of this. I had a pension and a paid-off house, and 38 years of savings, and I did not need $1 of it, and I never had. That was never what the fight was about. I think you probably understood that a long time before I did. So I called Frank Delgado in June, and I said, Frank, I want to do something, and I need you to tell me how. And on the 2nd of September, 1 year and 11 days after I walked into the Delaware County Probate Court in my wife's charcoal suit, the Margaret Ashford Reading Room opened on the 2nd floor of Lincoln Elementary School. She taught 4th grade there for 29 years. It is not large. It is 1,100 square feet, which was a storage room and a bad one, and I had it gutted down to the studs and rebuilt, and I did the load calculations myself, and I want to tell you that the beam over that room is rated for approximately 4 times what it will ever be asked to carry, and that a contractor laughed at me on site and asked if I was expecting an earthquake. I told him I wasn't building it for the earthquake. I was building it for the century. There are 2,011 books in it. There is a window seat, because Margaret always said, children read better when they can see out. And on the wall, on a small brass plate, it says, Margaret Ashford. She had no patience for people who were pretending. The principal asked me if I was sure about the wording. I told her I was very sure. Ella comes on Wednesdays. She's 13 now. She is being raised by Priscilla's sister, who is, I have discovered, a genuinely good woman who was as horrified by all of this as anyone. I have Ella and Sam every other weekend, and at Christmas, and for 2 weeks in July, and I drive them out to the house on Township Road 118, and we walk the property line. Sam is 9. He is still explaining sharks to me. He has moved on to a species I have never heard of. Ella asked me, in April, whether it was my fault her parents were gone. I have never been asked a harder question in my life. I told her the truth. I told her that her parents made a choice, and that I made a choice, about what to do after they made theirs, and that both of those things are true, and neither one cancels the other, and that when she is older, she will get to decide for herself what she thinks of me, and that I will accept it, whatever it is. She thought about it for a long time, and then she said, Grandpa, did you know the whole time? And I said, yes. And she said, even when you were pretending not to? And I said, especially then. She nodded, and she went back to her book. I write to my son, every week, every single week, on Sunday, at the kitchen table, on the same oak table where he put a deed in front of me. and brought his own pen. He writes back about one time in 4. The letters are not good. They are stiff and careful, and full of things neither of us mean. He asks about the roses. I tell him the truth, which is that I still prune them badly, every April, with a pair of green-handled shears. In the last letter, he wrote one line that I have read approximately 400 times. He wrote, "I keep thinking about the pantry. You were 4 feet away. I could have opened that door at any point in 6 months." And underneath it he wrote, "I didn't open it because I didn't want to see you." He gets out in 6 more years. I will be 78. I do not know what happens then. Anybody who tells you they know how a story like this ends is selling you something. I have not forgiven him, and I am not going to lie to you and say that I have, and I am not sure that forgiveness is even the correct word for whatever this is going to become. But I write on Sundays, and the letters go out, and that is not nothing. I want to leave you with one thing, and then I am done. People have asked me, friends, neighbors, a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch who I did not talk to, how I did it. How I sat at that table for 6 months and let them cut my food and take my keys and photograph my wife's roses and say nothing. And the answer is that I did not sit there and take it. That is what they think happened. That is what everybody thinks happened. They think an old man absorbed 6 months of humiliation because he was too weak to stop it. I was never absorbing it. I was measuring it. Every single time my son put his hand under my elbow on a step, I designed myself. I was not being helped. I was gathering data. Every time Priscilla explained something to me slowly, I was not being condescended to. I was watching a load path reveal itself. That is the whole trick. That is the entire, unglamorous, enormously difficult secret, and it costs more than anybody knows. Being underestimated is not something that happens to you. It is something you can decide to allow. Because the moment you correct them, the moment you snap, and prove how sharp you still are, and win that one small argument at the dinner table, they adjust. They get careful. They stop talking in front of you. And you have traded away the only advantage you had left, which is that they think the room is empty when you are standing in it. They are not afraid of an old man who is angry. They are afraid, it turns out, of an old man who is patient. I have spent my whole life around structures, and every collapse I ever investigated had the same thing in common. The building did not fail because it was old. The building failed because somebody looked at something they did not understand and decided, because it was quiet, that it was not carrying anything. That is what they thought about me. They looked at a quiet man in a big house and they decided the load was gone. And I want to tell you what I know now, at 72, in a house I designed when I was 30 and immortal, pruning my wife's roses badly every spring, for the rest of my life. Quiet is not empty. Quiet is just what strength sounds like when it has nothing left to prove. They spent 6 months telling everyone I was a house that was ready to come down. They should have checked what it was built on. If this story reached you, if you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have known you best, tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want more stories like this one, hit that like button and subscribe to Old Lion Stories. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself, and don't let anybody talk you out of who you are.